Welcome to the Book Triangle Podcast. I'm Dev.
And I'm Kavya.
We're really glad you could join us for another installment of our Navigating Modern India series.
Yes, thrilled to have you with us. Our whole mission here is, well, to take these key historical texts and periods and really distill them.
Right.
To give you the most important nuggets of knowledge, the insights you need, helping you get well-informed, quickly, but also thoroughly.
Absolutely. Whether you're actually prepping for competitive exams, which we know many of you are, or if you're simply curious, deeply curious about India's past, this series is really designed for you.
That's right. And today, we're continuing our exploration of modern India. We're drawing extensively, as we do in this series, from modern India by spectrum. It's such a foundational text for understanding this era.
Couldn't agree more. We're diving into Unit 4, specifically Chapter 8, and this covers a truly transformative period, the Socio-Religious Reform Movements of the 19th century.
A fascinating time. An era of really profound introspection and change across the board. And in this discussion, we'll try to unpack its various layers.
Okay.
We'll start by looking at the general features, what define these movements overall. Then we'll explore the fascinating factors that sparked this widespread desire for reform. It wasn't uniform, of course.
Right, across different communities, different regions. And from there, we'll get into the intellectual and social foundations that underpin these efforts.
Yeah.
What were the core ideas guiding the reformers?
Exactly. And crucially, we'll spend some significant time on the vital fight for the betterment of women's position.
So important.
And also the tenacious struggle against the deeply entrenched system of caste-based exploitation.
Then finally, we'll do a kind of survey looking at some of the most prominent reform movements and their key figures.
Right. Understanding not just what they did or achieved, but why their contributions mattered so immensely in the broader context of modern India's evolution.
Yeah, it's not just about dates and names, is it? It's about grasping the forces that really shaped the nation.
Precisely.
So let's begin. Let's set the stage for this truly transformative era and really try to uncover how a nation began to redefine itself from within.
It's an era that saw this, intriguing mix of motivations. You had internal desires for purification, for reform, and then you had these external pressures, particularly from colonial rule. It wasn't a simple straight line. It was a really dynamic period of questioning, of redefinition. #, understanding the foundation general features and driving forces of reform.
Okay, so to start us off, let's get a solid handle on what these socio-religious reform movements actually were. I mean, what were their overarching characteristics? Why are they so central to understanding 19th century India?
Well, these movements, they pop up all through the 19th century, and they weren't just isolated events. They really became part of India's, you could say, daily existence.
Right.
And their impact profoundly shaped the subcontinent. Fundamentally, they involved this really complex interplay. You had internal dynamics, so a society grappling with its own perceived shortcomings.
Okay.
And then external influences, particularly the impact of British colonial rule and the introduction of Western ideas. A key feature, a defining characteristic, was their engagement with modern scientific knowledge and Western thought. This often meant challenging traditional beliefs and practices head-on.
What I find particularly striking here is that the reformers, they were aiming for a genuine modernization of Indian society, right? But they were careful. They didn't advocate for just a blind, wholesale imitation of Western culture.
No, definitely not.
Their goal seems much more sophisticated. They wanted to integrate these progressive modern ideas, things like rationality, equality, individual liberty, into the existing Indian cultural streams. And this approach, it feels crucial. It allowed them to create a sort of favorable social climate for change, while at the same time trying to preserve and even strengthen their own cultural roots, like a selective adoption, not just throwing everything out.
Precisely. And importantly, this strategy directly countered that pervasive British colonial taunt, the idea that Indian religions and society were inherently decadent, static, inferior.
Well, that constant criticism.
By weeding out what they saw as corrupt elements, these outdated things, from religious beliefs and practices, these movements showed that Indian society was capable of self-correction, of internal rejuvenation.
That's a powerful point.
Yes, by systematically challenging and, weeding out these corrupt or outdated elements, these movements really empowered their followers. They could directly challenge those colonial narratives of inferiority.
Yeah.
It gave the rising Indian middle classes, who often felt this deep sense of humiliation from foreign conquest, it gave them robust cultural roots, a renewed sense of pride.
That makes sense.
And this promotion of a modern, this worldly, secular, and rational outlook, well, that was a monumental contribution. It fundamentally shifted these prevailing notions of pollution and purity.
Ah, right. Those concepts that dictated so much social hierarchy.
Exactly, for centuries. So this paved the way for a more inclusive, more equitable understanding of society. In essence, these movements helped end India's cultural and intellectual isolation from the rest of the world, fostering an environment where modern ideas could be absorbed, thought about, and thoughtfully integrated into India's own rich cultural heritage. It was about creating a resilient, forward-looking identity.
Okay, so if that's the nature, the character of these movements, what actually lit the fuse? What sparked this widespread desire for change? What specific factors created this, fertile ground for reform across India?
It was definitely multiple factors, all intertwined. They converged to create this compelling, undeniable need for reform. It wasn't just one thing.
Right.
The colonial government's presence, for instance, that played a decisive but incredibly complex role.
How so? Complex.
Well, unlike previous invaders, think of the Mughals or various Central Asian groups who had historically come to India, settled within its borders, and were eventually sort of absorbed by its culture, or at least interacted positively with it. The British conquest was entirely different. It arrived when India, compared to an enlightened 18th century Europe, post-scientific revolution, with a new scientific outlook, India presented this picture of stagnation, a static, often decadent society. So this external pressure from a technologically advanced, seemingly progressive colonial power, it exposed these glaring deficiencies within Indian society and religion. It forced a deep and often painful internal look, introspection.
And this external challenge, it was amplified, wasn't it, by the introduction of entirely new ideas through English education, concepts like liberty, equality, rationalism, foundational enlightenment stuff.
Absolutely. That exposure didn't just passively inform people, it actively forced enlightened Indians to critically reevaluate their own society, their traditions, their institutions.
So it wasn't just learning new things, it was comparing.
Exactly. They were confronted with this stark, uncomfortable contrast between European progress, even if seen through that colonial lens, and India's own deeply entrenched social ills. It wasn't just about adopting foreign ideas. It was about holding a mirror up to their own traditions, examining them through this new, often critical lens, and recognizing the urgent need for internal transformation. It really sparked a new kind of self-awareness.
And internally, you mentioned the social conditions. What were they like?
Internally, the social conditions in India during the 19th century were, to put it mildly, deeply depressing. Really quite grim in many ways. The position of women, for example, was particularly distressing, marked by pervasive inequalities, cruel practices. Female infanticide, the horrific practice of killing female infants at birth, was tragically not unusual in certain areas. Child marriage was another major societal problem. Girls married off incredibly young, sometimes before puberty, denied their childhood, their agency. Polygamy also widely prevailed. And the source even mentions a specific practice in Bengal called Kulinism, a form of hypergamy among certain Brahmin communities.
Kulinism.
Yes. Even old men would take multiple very young girls as wives. It led to situations where many women hardly had a married life worth the name, often just staying in their parents' homes.
That sounds awful. And then there was sati.
And here's where it truly highlights the urgent need for change. Among the higher castes, when their husbands died, widows were often tragically expected to commit sati, that horrifying ritual of self-immolation on the husband's funeral pyre.
Unimaginable.
The text really emphasizes Raja Rammohn Roy's courageous and pioneering crusade against this inhuman practice. He started his anti-sati struggle way back in 1818.
That early?
Yes, tirelessly citing sacred texts to prove that no authentic religious scripture actually sanctioned the burning alive of widows.
So he used religious arguments against a religious practice.
Exactly. But beyond just scriptural arguments, he appealed powerfully to humanity, to reason, to compassion. He was known to actively visit cremation grounds, organize vigilance groups to try and prevent it, and ceaselessly file counter-petitions to the government.
Wow.
His persistent advocacy ultimately led to the government regulation of 1829. This officially declared the practice of sati a crime throughout British India, a monumental achievement, a crucial legal and social victory showing the power of persistent, rational reform.
Absolutely monumental. What other social evils were reformers tackling?
Indeed, that was pivotal. But besides sati, other prevalent social evils continued to plague society. Untouchability, for instance, imposing severe restrictions, humiliation on a massive section of society, denying basic human dignity, access to public spaces, the rigid caste system itself, dividing people based solely on birth, perpetuating injustice, limiting social mobility.
Right.
Practices like animal sacrifice, various superstitions were rampant, afflicting both Hindu and Muslim communities, often leading to irrational beliefs, unnecessary suffering. There was also this perceived decline in genuine religious practices, often replaced by rigid, sometimes meaningless rituals. Coupled with increasing materialism, all these factors together highlighted this pressing need for, well, spiritual, social, and moral purification and reform within both major communities.
It's fascinating, though, how alongside those who embraced Western ideas, there was also this significant opposition, a resistance to what was seen as excessive Westernization.
Yes, definitely.
Many felt it gravely threatened Indian national identity, feared a complete erosion of their unique cultural heritage under the guise of just becoming modern.
That backlash, that sense of cultural preservation, it naturally led to a powerful reassertion of Indian cultural and intellectual inspiration.
Okay.
Thinkers like Swami Vivekananda, the celebrated philosopher and orator, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, the renowned novelist, and Swami Dayananda Saraswati, founder of the Arya Samaj, they emerged prominently during this period.
And what was their approach?
They actively countered the narrative of Western superiority. They did this by painting India's past in much brighter, more glorious colors, emphasizing the richness of Indian civilization, its profound spiritual and intellectual heritage.
Right. Reclaiming pride.
Exactly. Dayananda's powerful message, India for the Indians, resonated deeply. It became a rallying cry for those seeking to reclaim a distinct Indian identity and pride, exploding that myth of Western cultural and intellectual dominance, inspiring self-respect.
So just to clarify this point you made earlier, the socio-cultural regeneration wasn't created by colonialism, but occasioned by it.
Yes, it's a crucial distinction. It means the seeds of change, the internal issues, they were already there. But the colonial encounter acted as a catalyst.
Okay.
It brought existing internal contradictions and these external challenges into sharp focus. Educated Indians began to question the existing social order with a new urgency, recognizing the undeniable need for change from within. They became consciously aware of their society's shortcomings, the pressing necessity for reform, not just to counter colonial criticism or to appear modern to the British, but for the inherent betterment and progress of their own people. It was a profound moment of self-discovery, of agency, spurred, perhaps ironically, by foreign dominance, #tag ideological underpinnings, and reform direction.
That's a really powerful distinction. So if these were the driving forces, who exactly were the individuals leading these movements?
Yeah.
And what intellectual principles truly guided them? What was the common thread?
Well, the social base for this regeneration was primarily the newly emerging middle class and educated intellectuals.
Right, the Bhadralok in Bengal, for example.
Yes, on a group. But it was diverse. It included both those traditionally educated and indigenous systems and the growing number of Western-educated individuals.
Okay.
This group included professionals like zamindars, landholders, moneylenders, modern professionals like doctors, lawyers, teachers, government officials.
It's a real mix.
A real mix. But there was often this significant contrast between their middle-class ideals, frequently derived from Western developments, liberal thought, and the, well, non-middle-class social realities they aimed to reform.
Ah, okay. So a gap between their ideas and the ground reality.
Exactly. It meant their approach was often this delicate balancing act, trying to implement modern views within existing, often deeply traditional social conditions.
Makes sense. And ideologically, what unified them?
What truly unified these diverse movements ideologically were three core principles: rationalism, religious universalism, and humanism.
Rationalism first. How did that play out?
Rationalism was systematically applied to judge the social relevance, the utility of existing practices. Raja Ram Mohan Roy, for example, firmly believed in causality linking the entire phenomenal universe. He emphasized demonstrability as the sole criterion of truth. Rejecting anything that couldn't be proved by reason or logically explained, he questioned rituals, superstitions that lacked logical grounding.
And Akshay Kumar Dutt took it even further, didn't he?
He did, famously declaring, "Rationalism is our only preceptor." He argued that all natural and social phenomena could be analyzed and understood by purely mechanical processes, essentially arguing for a scientific, empirical approach to life and society.
So replacing faith with reason.
In evaluating socio-religious practices, yes, it was a fundamental shift, replacing blind faith, adherence to tradition, with rigorous rationality.
And the consequence.
A direct consequence was the Brahmo Samaj repudiating the infallibility of the Vedas, choosing instead to judge their tenets against modern reason, contemporary social utility. That was radical, a real break from orthodoxy.
And this wasn't just limited to Hindu reform, right?
No, not at all. The Aligarh movement, championed by Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, actively emphasized reconciling Islamic teachings with the needs of the modern age.
Right.
Syed Ahmed Khan even stated that religious tenets were not immutable, implying they could be reinterpreted to align with contemporary understanding and progress. A highly significant reformist stance for the Muslim community at the time.
That is significant. And humanism.
Humanistic ideals, like social equality, the inherent equal worth of every individual, these were also central. This humanistic impulse was a powerful driver for social reforms, pushing for dignity, rights for all, regardless of caste, creed, or gender.
Okay. And you mentioned two streams earlier, reformist and revivalist.
Yes. The reform movements, despite these shared ideological bases, generally flowed in two main streams, sometimes complementary, sometimes conflicting. Reformist and revivalist. Both sought to reform society, but their methods, their interpretations of tradition, differed significantly.
Right. So how exactly did they differ? Why is that distinction important?
Well, the reformists, like the Brahmo Sam, they aimed to adapt religious and social practices to modern changes, often advocating for a definitive break from what they saw as outdated, corrupt, or inhumane traditions. They generally looked forward, seeking progress through intellectual, social evolution, embracing new ideas.
Okay, adapting and changing.
Conversely, the revivalists, like the Arya Samaj, they sought to restore what they perceived as past glory, often by reinterpreting ancient texts, particularly the Vedas, as the ultimate source of truth and guidance.
Going back to the roots.
Believing that by returning to what they saw as the pure, original forms of their religion and society, they could overcome current social ills. What's fascinating, though, is that both streams,
Yes.
despite their differing approaches, ultimately contributed to the modernization of India by addressing social ills, fostering a spirit of inquiry, inspiring change, just through different pathways.
That's a key takeaway. And the direction of social reform itself.
The humanistic ideals of social equality, the equal worth of all individuals, which profoundly inspired this newly educated middle class, they greatly influenced the entire field of social reform, and these movements were intrinsically linked to religious reforms, primarily because many prevalent social ills like untouchability, gender inequity often derive their legitimacy and were frequently sanctioned by religious texts or interpretations at the time.
So you had to tackle religion to tackle society.
In many cases, yes. Reforming society often necessitated a fundamental reevaluation or even outright rejection of certain religious beliefs or practices.
But you also mentioned it became more secular later.
That's right. Later in this period, the social reform movement gradually began to dissociate itself from a purely religious framework. It adopted a more secular approach.
Why was that significant?
It allowed reforms to be argued on principles of human rights, justice, rationality, rather than solely on scriptural interpretation. Broaden the appeal, perhaps. What's more, while initially limited mostly to upper and middle classes, upper castes, who were trying, as we said, to balance modern views with existing conditions, the movement eventually broadened its base. It started to penetrate the lower strata of society, making it a more inclusive, comprehensive drive for change, moving beyond just religious reinterpretation to a more fundamental restructuring of social norms, power dynamics across all levels. #tag major social reform agendas, women and caste.
Okay, let's dive into one of the most significant aspects then. The intense focus on women's rights and their position in society. What were the key issues they tackled, and what were the major efforts here?
The reformers really vehemently attacked a whole range of deeply entrenched social ills affecting women. These were seen as fundamental barriers to a just, humane society.
Such as?
Things like female infanticide, the pervasive system of child marriage, the cruel ritual of sati, and the deplorable, often miserable condition of widows. Each of these practices contributed to a structure that severely oppressed women.
And reformers saw their abolition as critical for progress.
Absolutely. Critical for India's progress.
We talked about Raja Rammohan Roy and Sati. His crusade was truly pioneering.
Yes, determined and pioneering, leading the struggle from 1818. His efforts were multifaceted, incredibly persistent.
Right, citing texts, appealing to reason.
Exactly, meticulously citing sacred texts to prove Safi wasn't sanctioned by genuine religion, appealing powerfully to logic, humanity, compassion. But his activism wasn't just scholarly debate. No, he actively visited cremation grounds to intervene, organized vigilance groups, tirelessly filed counter-petitions to the government, countering the orthodox demands to keep the practice.
That took immense courage.
It did, and his relentless advocacy, as we noted, culminated in that landmark government regulation of 1829, declaring sati a crime. A monumental achievement showing the impact one individual's persistent rational efforts could have.
Absolutely. What about widow remarriage? That was another huge issue, wasn't it?
A crucial area. Addressing the immense suffering of young widows, often condemned to a life of austerity, social ostracism. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar's tireless efforts here were particularly noteworthy.
What did he do?
He engaged in extensive scholarly work, meticulously citing ancient Hindu scriptures to demonstrate that traditional texts did not forbid the remarriage of widows.
So using the tradition against itself in a way?
Precisely,
Okay.
effectively dismantling the traditional religious opposition. His relentless campaigning, gathering thousands of signatures, lobbying the government, directly led to the passage of the Hindu Widows Remarriage Act of 1856.
Another legal victory.
Yes, but beyond legislation, figures like Dando Keshav Karve and Mahadeo Govind Ranad also championed this cause. They recognized the practical need to support widows.
Yeah.
They established widows' homes, providing not just shelter but vital education, vocational training, enabling these women to become self-sufficient, lead dignified, independent lives. It was about more than just legal rights. It was practical empowerment.
And education for women, that must have been central too.
Absolutely central. Rightly seen as essential for their upliftment, empowerment, overall societal progress. Vidyasagar, recognizing this fundamental need, dedicated himself to this cause, founded numerous girls' schools, especially in Bengal, significantly contributing to female literacy. Jyotiba Phule, a firm believer in gender equality, a radical social revolutionary, took an even bolder step, pioneering. He opened one of India's first girls' schools in Pune in 1848.
With his wife, Savitribai.
With the active help of his courageous wife, Savitribai Phule, who became one of India's first female teachers. This was groundbreaking at a time when female education was heavily resisted, seen as against tradition.
Incredible. And Annie Besant.
Annie Besant, too, through her involvement in the Theosophical movement, contributed significantly to women's education, establishing institutions consistently advocating for their intellectual development.
Were there legislative efforts beyond sati and widow remarriage, like child marriage?
Yes, other significant legislative and social reforms aimed at improving women's status. Addressing the persistent issue of child marriage was key. The Civil Marriage Act of 1872 was a step,
Okay.
fixing the minimum age for girls at 14 and boys at 18 for civil marriages, though it was only applicable initially to those who weren't Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Parsis, or Jews.
Limited scope then.
Initially, but it was later reinforced and expanded by the Sarda Act of 1930. This more broadly raised the ages to 14 for girls and 18 for boys across all communities, a significant legal stride against premature marriages.
Good. And polygamy.
Abolition of polygamy was also strongly advocated by reformers. Recognized as another practice that subjugated women, severely undermined their rights and dignity. These efforts, legislative and social, aimed to systematically dismantle the barriers that had oppressed women for centuries, moving towards a more equitable, just society.
Okay, moving on to another deeply ingrained social issue.
Yeah.
The caste system and untouchability. This feels even more complex given its deep roots. How did these movements tackle it?
You're right. The struggle against caste was incredibly complex. From the mid-19th century onwards, numerous organizations, Brahma Samaj, Prathana Samaj, Arya Samaj, Ramakrishna Mission, Theosophists, the social conference worked tirelessly on this front.
What were the methods?
Their efforts were multi-pronged. They aimed to spread education among untouchables, recognizing knowledge as a powerful key to empowerment, upward mobility. They also worked relentlessly to remove restrictions on temple entry, the use of public facilities like ponds, wells, bathing ghats, which were traditionally denied to them, directly challenging the physical and social segregation.
Right, the everyday humiliations.
Exactly. Now, what's interesting is that while many early reformers defended the Chaturvarna system, the conceptual fourfold division based on occupation or character,
Yes.
they fiercely criticized untouchability, seeing it as a corrupt, inhumane deviation from what they believed were true, original Hindu principles.
So distinguishing between the ideal and the reality.
Precisely. They particularly attacked the rigid, hereditary basis of caste distinctions, arguing caste should be based on merit or profession, not birth. They vehemently questioned the law of karma when it was used to legitimize this undemocratic institution, trapping people by birth. They urged people to work for betterment in this world, the real social sphere, not just strive for salvation after death.
Any examples?
The Arya Samaj, for instance. While crusading against Hindu society, disintegrating into myriad subcastes, it aimed to reconstruct it on a purified fourfold division. Significantly, upholding the right of even the lowest caste to study scriptures, a privilege previously denied for centuries.
That's a major shift. And then came Dr. Ambedkar.
Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's role here is pivotal, truly transformative. Recognizing the limitations of earlier reform efforts, he dedicated his life to the upliftment of Dalits.
What were his key actions?
In 1924, he established the Bahishkrit Hidakarini Sabha, an organization explicitly for the welfare of the depressed classes. With that powerful, enduring motto, educate, agitate, and organize.
Educate, agitate, organize.
Yes, aiming not just to highlight Dalit grievances before the government, but to actively mobilize them for their own rights, fostering self-respect, collective action.
And the burning of the Manusmriti.
In a deeply symbolic radical act, yes. He famously burnt the Manusmriti in 1927 at Mahad during a public conference. That text was often cited to justify social inequalities, the caste system, Dalit subjugation. Burning it was a defiant declaration, a total rejection of that oppressive social order.
A very powerful statement. You mentioned earlier the limitations of the British government in tackling caste.
Yes, the struggle against caste discrimination continued intensely into free India. And what's insightful is understanding the colonial administration's limitations.
They couldn't go too far.
They largely avoided radical measures that might invite hostile reactions from orthodox sections, who often provided crucial support for their rule. True, comprehensive upliftment, economic, political for marginalized communities like Dalits could fundamentally only happen in a free India.
Because an independent government would be accountable to its own people.
Exactly, and could commit to comprehensive social transformation without those external political calculations.
And that's what happened post-independence.
Precisely. The Constitution of Free India made equality and non-discrimination based on caste an imperative legal principle. It legally abolished untouchability, declared enforcing any disability arising from it unlawful, punishable by law. Furthermore, the Constitution explicitly forbids restrictions on access to public facilities, wells, tanks, bathing ghats, hotels, cinemas, clubs, dismantling the legal basis for public segregation. More broadly, it laid down a directive principle for the state to strive to promote the welfare of the people by securing and protecting a social order in which justice, social, economic, and political, shall inform all the institutions of the national life, providing a robust legal and ideological framework for ongoing social justice, affirmative action, a direct legacy of those 19th century reform movements. #, a survey of key sociocultural reform movements.
Okay, let's survey some of those specific movements then, the ones that really spearheaded these changes, looking at their unique contributions, the influential figures. We've touched on some, but let's delve deeper into the key ones, starting with the Brahmo Samaj.
We must. Founded in 1828 by the towering figure of Raja Rammohan Roy, a pioneering reformist movement in Bengal, based on those twin pillars, reason and the intellectual heritage of the Vedas and Upanishads.
And his core beliefs.
Roy firmly believed in monotheism, vehemently denounced polytheism, idol worship as corruptions, critically attacked caste rigidity, sati, child marriage, advocating for a more rational, humane social order. His efforts, as we saw, led directly to the abolition of sati in 1829, a testament to the Samaj's early impact.
And Debendranath Tagore. He revitalized it.
Significantly revitalized it in 1842. He headed the Tatvabodhini Sabha, founded in 1839, along with its influential Bengali journal, the Tatvabodhini Patrika, devoted to systematically studying India's past with a rational outlook, propagating Roy's ideas.
What causes did the revitalized Samaj champion?
Critical social causes: widow remarriage, women's education, abolition of polygamy. Importantly, Tagore worked on two fronts: as a reformist movement within Hinduism, promoting internal purification, and resolutely opposing Christian missionaries who were actively criticizing Hinduism and attempting conversions, so also serving as a defender of Hindu cultural identity.
Then came Keshab Chandra Sen with a more radical approach.
Yes. He joined later, brought a more radical universalist approach, helped popularize the movement outside Bengal, even aligned with Christian missionaries for certain social reforms, universal brotherhood, social justice.
But this led to splits.
His radical views, yes, including his emphasis on Christ, universalist leanings, they eventually led to significant doctrinal differences. Subsequent splits within the Brahmo Samaj in 1866 and 1878, weakening its cohesion, its pan-Indian potential.
So foundational, but its lasting influence was more limited.
Ultimately, yes, primarily limited to Calcutta and Bengal. It didn't have that lasting, truly pan-Indian impact, despite its immense historical importance as a pioneering force.
Okay, moving west now. The Prathana Samaj in Bombay, founded in 1867.
Another significant reformist movement, founded by Atmaram Pandurang with Keshab Chandra Sen's direct help, drew philosophical inspiration from the Brahmo Samaj. It was a kind of spiritual successor to the Paramahansa Sabha.
A secret society.
Yes, established earlier in 1849 in Maharashtra, aimed to spread liberal ideas, break down caste barriers, but without much public visibility.
And Mahadeo Govindranade was key here.
Instrumental, a towering figure of social reform. Joining the Prathana Samaj in 1870, he gave it an all-India character, expanded its reach beyond Maharashtra.
How did his focus differ from the Brahmo Samaj?
It focused more intently on practical social reforms than abstract religious doctrine, though it did emphasize monotheism, its clear four-point social agenda, disapproval of the caste system, promoting women's education, advocating widow remarriage, and raising the age of marriage.
And Ranade founded the widow remarriage movement, too.
With Dando Keshavkarf, yes, staunch champions. Also the Widows' Home Association, providing education and training for widows. The Samaj's approach was typically reliant on education, persuasion, public opinion, gradual change rather than direct confrontation with orthodoxy.
Right. Now, the Ramakrishna movement, a different kind of approach. Spiritual.
Very much so. Led by the saintly Ramakrishna Paramhansa and his brilliant disciple Swami Vivekananda, aimed to synthesize ancient Hindu philosophy, particularly Vedanta, with modern needs. A strong, practical emphasis on social service.
And Ramakrishna's core teaching.
The essential unity of all religions, famously stating, as many faiths, so many paths, emphasizing diverse paths to God, tolerance.
And Vivekananda took this message global.
He truly internationalized it, a passionate advocate for Hindu revivalism, but crucially with a universal, practical outlook. Traveled internationally, famously attending the World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893.
Where he made a huge impact.
Captivated audiences, stressing the essential unity of religions, religious tolerance, India's spiritual contributions. He founded the Ramakrishna Mission in 1897.
Focused on service.
Dedicated to philanthropic social work, spreading the message of selfless service, karma yoga, and universal brotherhood. The mission rejected caste restrictions, superstitions, aimed to overhaul the education system, character building, practical knowledge, a spiritual philosophy applied to social upliftment.
Then there's Dayananda Saraswati and the Arya Samaj, founded in 1875. With that call, back to the Vedas, what did that mean in practice?
His call back to the Vedas was revolutionary. It meant a deliberate rejection of later Hindu scriptures, Puranas, etc., which he saw as corruptions, interpolations leading to social ills.
So purification.
Yes. Strongly denounced idolatry, polytheism, caste system based on birth, arguing these were not truly Vedic, passionately supported women's education, widow remarriage, believing these were consistent with original pure Vedic teachings.
And reconstructing society.
Aimed to reconstruct Hindu society not as myriad subcastes, but on a purified fourfold division based on merit and profession. Significantly upholding the right of even the lowest castes to study scriptures, wear the sacred thread, previously denied for centuries.
And the political message. India for the Indians.
Not just religious, a powerful articulation of burgeoning nationalism, self-pride, advocating indigenous rule, cultural autonomy. Very potent.
Okay, shifting focus now to the Muslim community. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and the Aligarh movement, also 1875, focused on modern education. What was his vision?
His vision was deeply rooted in pragmatism. He believed for Muslims to progress, catch up with other communities, particularly Hindus, who had an early start in Western education. They needed to embrace modern Western science and the English language. He saw the Muslim community had fallen behind economically, socially, after the Mughal decline.
So education was the key.
Absolutely. To this end, he founded the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College at Aligarh in 1875, which later became the prestigious Aligarh Muslim University.
And his stance on politics.
He strongly believed Muslims should prioritize education, securing jobs, not engaging in immediate political activity. He feared political action then would invite hostility from the British, further disadvantaging the community.
Right. Reconciliation with modernity.
Yes, he stressed reconciling Islamic teachings with the needs of the modern age. Even arguing religious tenets weren't immutable, could be reinterpreted to align with modern progress, scientific understanding, a significant reformist stance, aiming to bring Muslims into the mainstream without abandoning their faith.
But alongside Aligarh, there were other Islamic movements with a strong revivalist flavor, like the Wahhabi Waliullah movement.
Indeed. These represented a different response. The Wahhabi movement, founded by Syed Ahmed of Raebareli, inspired by Abdul Wahhab of Saudi Arabia and Shah Waliullah of Delhi,
Their focus.
vehemently condemned Western influence on Islam, advocated a strict return to pure Islam, society as perceived in the Prophet's time, cleansing practices of un-Islamic innovations, had a countrywide organization, bases in Sithana, Northwest, Patna,
And they engaged in conflict?
initially declared jihad against the Sikh kingdom of Punjab. After Punjab's annexation by the British in 1849, the English became their sole target, showing their anti-colonial stance.
What about Titu Mir's movement?
Titu Mir, a disciple of Syed Ahmed, organized Muslim peasants in Bengal, primarily against oppressive Hindu landlords, British indigo planters, advocating Sharia law for justice. He was killed in action in 1831, confronting British police, highlighting the direct, sometimes violent resistance.
And the Faraitzi movement in eastern Bengal.
Yeah.
Similar focus.
Similar focus on religious reform and purification. Led by Shariatullah and his son Dadu Mian, 1838-1857. Aimed to abolish un-Islamic practices that had crept into local customs, stressed rigorous adherence to Islamic pillars of faith, Quran and Sunnah.
Did it have a socioeconomic dimension?
Yes, Dadamian took a more radical socioeconomic stance, famously declared land belonged to God, no one could levy taxes without divine sanction. This resonated strongly with the local peasantry, often exploited by landlords, gained significant support, a movement of both spiritual and material liberation.
What about the Ahmadiyya movement, founded later in 1889? How did it fit in?
Founded by Mirza Ghulam Ahmad in Punjab, presented itself as an Islamic Renaissance movement, emphasizing a reformist approach within Islam, advocating peace, tolerance,
How did it differ?
based on principles of a universal religion, advocated peaceful defense of Islam against external attacks, missionaries, Hindu revivalists through intellectual, moral arguments, not confrontation. Uniquely, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad proclaimed himself a messiah and even an incarnation of Lord Krishna.
Interesting. Highlighting universalism.
Yes, underscoring his belief in common spiritual truths across faiths. A syncretic approach, setting it apart from more puritanical movements.
And the Deoband school, established 1866, contrasting with Aligarh.
Yes, established by Muhammad Qasim Nanotavi and Rashid Ahmed Gangohi. Unlike Aligarh's focus on Western education and rapprochement with the British, Deoband concentrated primarily on moral and religious regeneration through traditional Islamic scholarship, maintaining a conservative stance against Western influences, emphasizing rigorous traditional Islamic education, living strictly by Islamic laws, protecting Islam from perceived corrupting Western influence.
But some evolution there, too.
Interestingly, yes. A prominent supporter, Shibli Numani, later favored including English and European sciences, and importantly believed in Hindu-Muslim cooperation, forming the Nadwat al-Ulama and Darul Uloom in Lucknow in 1894-96, promoting a slightly more inclusive approach within that fundamentally conservative framework.
Okay, let's look at the Parsi reform movements, starting 1851. Small community, but influential reforms.
Very influential. The Ranumai Mazdayasnan Safa, or Religious Reform Association, founded 1851 by English-educated Parsis, aiming for regeneration of the social conditions of the Parsis and the restoration of the Zoroastrian religion to its pristine purity.
Key figures.
Luminaries like Nauroji Furdanji, Dadabhai Nauroji, who became a major Congress figure later, K.R. Kama, S.S. Bengali. They spread their message through the influential newspaper Rast Guftar Truth Teller.
What were their main reform areas?
Both religious and social. Reforming Parsi rituals, redefining the creed to be more rational, and significantly, uplifting Parsi women, removing purdah, raising marriage age, actively promoting education. As a direct result, the Parsis emerged as one of the most westernized, educated, progressive sections of Indian society.
And the Sikh reform movements, the Singh Sabha movement from 1873.
The Sikhs, too, were part of this wave. The Singh Sabha movement, founded in Amritsar, had two primary objectives.
Which were?
First, making modern Western education widely available to Sikhs, recognizing its importance for community progress, competing in the colonial structure. A network of Khalsa schools was established across Punjab, providing modern education alongside religious instruction.
And the second objective?
Equally important, countering the proselytizing activities of various groups, Christian missionaries, Brahmo Samajists, Arya Samajists, Muslim Malvis who were actively seeking converts from the Sikh community, which was facing an identity crisis.
How did they counter this?
By working to reject practices deemed against the Guru's original teachings, establishing rites, customs consistent with pure Sikh doctrine, strengthening Sikh identity, fostering community cohesion, instilling pride in their unique heritage.
Now, the Theosophical movement. Global Connections, unique foothold in India, founded 1875.
Yes, a distinct flavor. Founded by Madame H.P. Blavatsky and Colonel M.S. Olcott in New York. Brought to India in 1882, establishing international HQ at Adyar near Madras.
What do they advocate?
Study of ancient religions, philosophies, sciences, particularly Eastern ones. Promoted universal brotherhood. Believed in the latent spiritual power in man. Fundamentally allied with the Hindu Renaissance, providing a framework for reevaluating ancient Indian wisdom.
And their social reform agenda.
Despite the spiritual core, drawing from Vedas, Upanishads, they championed significant social reforms, vehemently opposed child marriage, advocated abolition of caste discrimination, worked for the uplift of outcasts, widows, striving for a more equitable society rooted in spiritual principles, unity of all beings.
And Annie Besant's role here was huge, wasn't it, coming to India in 1893?
Absolutely compelling. A prominent Irish theosophist, dynamic orator, became international president after Olcott's death in 1907, greatly popularized the movement across India, infused it with political, social activism, integrated Indian thought more deeply.
And her contribution to education?
Particularly significant. Founded the Central Hindu College in Benares in 1898, notably teaching both Hindu religion and Western sciences, a synthesis of tradition and modernity. This college later became the nucleus for the renowned Benares Hindu University in 1916.
Wow.
Beyond this, Besant also did much for women's education, actively promoting schools, educational opportunities for girls and women across India. Her blend of spiritualism and practical social action made her incredibly influential.
We should probably mention a few other key individuals and movements briefly, too.
Definitely. Figures like Gopalari Deshmukh, known as Lokahitwadi, benefactor of the people, a rationalist from Maharashtra.
What did he advocate?
Held a judge's post under the British, but dedicated himself to social reform. Wrote extensively for the weekly Prabhakar. Forcefully advocated reorganizing Indian society on rational, humanistic, secular values. Famously challenged orthodoxy, stating, "If religion does not sanction social reform, then change religion."
Truly radical for the time.
Extremely. He also played a leading role founding periodicals like Hitekchu, Gyam Prakash, Indu Prakash, using the press to spread reformist ideas.
And Jyotiba Phule again, awarded Mahatma.
Yes, his work deserves re-emphasis. Pioneer in women's education, tirelessly worked for widow remarriage, opened a home for widows in 1854, offering sanctuary support. His groundbreaking work with Savitribai, opening that girls' school in 1848, exemplifies his unwavering commitment to gender equality, educational access, especially for the marginalized.
And the Temple Entry movement, particularly in Kerala.
Gained significant momentum there, yes. A region where caste discrimination, untouchability were notoriously rigid. Saw pivotal events like the Vaikom Satyagraha in 1924,
led by
figures like K. Kalapan, and the Guruvayur Satyagraha in 1931, involving poet Subramaniam Tirumambu, leaders like P. Krishna Pillai, A.K. Gopalan.
What were they demanding?
Nonviolent protests demanding the right of lower castes, untouchables to enter temples, use public roads around them, directly challenging centuries of exclusion.
Did they succeed?
Ultimately, these persistent struggles led to a landmark moment. The Maharaja of Travancore issued a proclamation in 1936, opening all government-controlled temples to all Hindus, followed by a similar step by the C. Rajagopalachari administration in Madras in 1938, significant victories against caste-based exclusion, setting a precedent. #, outro.
So, Kavya, what does all this mean? looking back, this incredible ferment of activity, these socio-religious reform movements of the 19th century, they were truly foundational, weren't they? Far more than just a list of reforms.
Absolutely. They weren't just about changing individual practices. It was about a widespread, deep-seated questioning of societal norms, a tenacious striving for a more just, more equitable India. A profound awakening, really. A collective conscience pushing back against entrenched injustices, superstitions, the very concept of inherited inequality. They laid the crucial intellectual and social groundwork for the much larger nationalist movement that followed, demonstrating the power of critical thinking, social awareness, collective action from within.
How did it help the nationalist movement?
By courageously reforming their own society, rooting out internal weaknesses, Indians were better able to counter those colonial critiques of backwardness and to build a stronger, more unified identity, absolutely necessary for the eventual push for self-rule.
Right.
They showed that true, lasting change often begins by examining and reforming the very fabric of society, paving the way for larger political aspirations, a truly modern nation.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it?
Yeah.
That progress is rarely linear. It almost always requires challenging, deeply held beliefs, even centuries-old ones. And what's fascinating is how these different approaches, reformists looking forward, revivalists looking to a purified past, both ultimately contributed to this larger narrative of social evolution, self-redefinition.
Absolutely. This journey into the socio-religious reform movements is just one crucial chapter in our Navigating Modern India series, drawing, as always, from Modern India by Spectrum. We sincerely hope this discussion has provided you with valuable insights and enhanced understanding of this truly pivotal period, whether you're preparing for competitive examinations or simply broadening your knowledge of India's fascinating history.
We'll definitely continue to cover all the chapters of Modern India by Spectrum in our upcoming episodes, ensuring you get a comprehensive, insightful understanding of this rich, complex history.
So make sure to stay tuned for more insightful discussions. And maybe as you reflect on this period of immense social transformation, consider this thought. How do the debates and divisions we saw back in the 19th century reform movements, between radical change and selective preservation of tradition, how do those echoes continue to play out in India's journey today as it navigates its identity in this rapidly globalizing world? Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us on the Book Triangle podcast.
Thank you. We look forward to exploring more of India's incredible history with you.